Hi everybody, I'm Pia from Stitches and Scraps, and today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful two-color basket. For this project, you're going to be using Crayola Off the Hook yarn from Lion Brand. I got this yarn for free from Lion Brand for this design, and I just love the colors. They teamed up with Crayola to get those typical crayon colors, and for this project you're going to need 2 skeins of the cornflower blue and 1 skein of the fern. You will also need some of this mesh plastic canvas stuff. This is to add rigidity to the basket, and I used this piece, which it's a Doris brand. It's 12 inches by 18 inches, and that worked perfectly for me. What I ended up doing was cutting it in half lengthwise, so right here, all the way across, and then tying the 2 pieces together to make the size that I needed. So this is the size that worked for me, but if you find a different size that works better, that's great. You just need to be able to make a mesh ring to fit around the inside of your basket. You also will need to have some sort of stitch marker. I like this clothespin type. This is to mark the beginning of your rounds. And you will need a crochet hook for weaving in your ends, something large enough to handle the yarn. And that's it, so let's get started. The first step is to make sure that we have enough of a tail to weave in later. This much is probably okay, but I'd rather have a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the first loop. And if you look at these, they're actually just loops of yarn like this, okay, that are sewn together with a thread. So if you separate it, I don't know if I'll be able to show this really clearly on camera, but if you separate out all the fuzz, you can see a thin little thread in the middle there. In this case, it's a thin white thread. Do you see that? So that's what we're going to cut. And when we cut just that little thread, it separates this out and gives us more of a tail. So now I have a really good tail to work with. That is the first step. So normally when you knit, you have a number of stitches on your needle, and you insert your other needle into the stitch and pull up a loop like this through the stitch, right? Well, in this case, the loops are already made and they're held in place by that thread like we showed you when we cut it. So you don't have to do any pulling up of loops. You're just going to take one loop and push it through the other loop, okay? Because the loops are already in place. So that's why you don't need any needles. Let's start with round 1. And all we're going to do for round 1 is make ourselves a circle of 1, 2, 3, 4 loops, okay? So there's 4 loops. And now everything in this yarn is a loop because it's a loopy yarn. So to distinguish, just to make the language easier as I'm talking, if it's something that's already been worked, I'm going to call it a stitch. If it's something that's on my working yarn that I haven't worked with yet, I'm going to call it a loop. That way I can say things like pull the next loop through the next stitch and you guys don't get confused. So this is a stitch, this is a loop. So let's start on round 2, because round 1 was easy. We just made a circle out of 4 loops and that made us a 4-stitch round. For round 2, we're going to put 2 stitches into each one of these stitches, and we're going to work them as knit stitches. To do a knit stitch, you bring the working yarn up from the back through to the front, and that is a knit stitch. Now to make that an increase, we're going to bring another loop up through from the back to the front, and that's an increase. So now this stitch has 2 stitches in it. I'm going to do that with each of the next of these 3 remaining stitches here. One, 2, 1, 2, and there we have round 2, which has 8 stitches in it now because we worked 2 into each of those earlier 4. So there's 2, 4, 6, 8 stitches. For round 3, we want to increase by 8 stitches, so we're going to do the exact same thing again. We're going to pull 2 loops through each of these 8 stitches. Before we start, it's a good idea to mark the first stitch of your round so that you can keep track when you get to it. As we start to get bigger, that's going to be an issue. So I like to use this clothespin type of marker for this project, only because it's easy to move and it doesn't get stuck in the loops. So let's go on. For the next round, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to increase in every single stitch. So there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Now you want to make sure not to accidentally skip a stitch. If one of those loops is hidden, you don't want to miss it, otherwise you'll just have a random loop hanging out on the inside of your basket. And you can weave it in, it's not the end of the world, it's just better if you don't miss it. So this should be my last one. Now you also want to try not to twist the stitches, make sure they're lying flat. Otherwise you get the same effect as with twisted stitches in knitting. But it's not that noticeable because the yarn's fuzzy. So again, it's not the end of the world, you just want to try to keep the stitches straight. So now I know I finished the round because I came back to my marker, and I have 16 stitches now in this round. So we're going on to round 4. And now for round 4, I want to increase by 8 stitches again. In fact, every round now we're going to be increasing by 8 stitches. So in order to do that, I need to increase and then do a knit stitch, and then increase and do a knit stitch. So I'm increasing in every alternate stitch. So here's the first stitch, and I'm going to do an increase in that one. And then I'm just going to do a regular knit stitch in the next stitch. And then let's untwist this. There we go. We'll do an increase in this one. And a regular knit stitch in this one. And I'm going to keep doing that all the way around. Increase, knit, increase, knit. I finished that round and I noticed I made a mistake. Actually, I made a mistake on purpose so I could show you. I've accidentally skipped this loop. Now I caught it, this loop was on the working yarn and I just missed it. This should have been the loop that I pushed through here. Now, because I've caught it right now, there's a really easy fix. I'm just going to take this loop and push it up through with the one next to it. And on the next round, I'm going to work these 2 loops together as though they're one. So if you catch a missed loop right away, you can fix it very easily without having to weave anything in. So now this combined 2 loops becomes our next stitch, our first stitch of the round. Okay, so now for the remaining rounds for the whole bottom of the basket, I'm just going to continue to increase by 8 stitches every time. And I can push this tail through to the wrong side now. And then this will be the bottom of our basket. So I'm going to continue till I finish the bottom, and then I'll come back before I get to the edging. I finished my base. I now have a circle with 48 loops around the outside, 48 stitches on it. So now I'm ready to bind off to create a decorative edge and to allow us to start working in a different direction. I'm going to start with my first stitch, the one that has the marker on it, remove the marker, and I'm going to pull the next stitch through the first one. Then I'm going to pull the next stitch through this one. And I'm going to keep going around, pulling the next stitch through the current stitch all the way around. I finished binding off, and you can see I have 1 loop left that I haven't dealt with yet. That's fine, leave it aside, we're going to deal with it in a minute. I want to zoom in and show you what the edge looks like. You can see that we have V-shapes along the edge. Each one of those is a stitch. So what we're going to be doing, this is the bottom side of your basket. This is the outside, the side that's going to show. When you flip it over, which we'll do in a minute, you'll see it looks like this, which is the inside of your basket. So keeping that in mind, we finished the bottom, and now what we're going to do is we're going to start making the sides. So we're going to build up this way along the sides, build up this way. So in order to do that, we're going to need to take these loops and start pushing them through this way. So you're going to find your V shapes and you're going to start pushing loops through like this so that they stick out on the side of the basket. In order to do that, our working yarn has to be on this side. Okay, so before we join, we want to make sure we move our working yarn to this side, to this right side of the fabric. Right now, that is moving it in front. Now we're going to join, which means taking this last loop of our bind off and shoving it through in the same direction that we just said we're going to be working through the first one. So there you go. Now that loop is going to become the first stitch of our next round for our sides. So now I'm going to go ahead and mark this as the first stitch of our round, and we're going to continue going around, pushing these loops through. Now it's from the front to the back through each of these stitches. And remember, find the V shape and get under it, and that's where your loop goes through. If we do this, then we will end up with 48 stitches sticking out that are going to form our sides. I finished pushing all my loops through, and I have 48 loops around the edge. Now when I flip this over, you'll see this is the inside of the basket, and here I have 48 loops sticking up around the edge that I'm going to start working around. Sorry, around this way. So I should note, you can work this whole thing clockwise or counterclockwise. It doesn't matter. Whichever way is more comfortable for you is fine. I just happened to start out one way and kept going that way. The only thing you don't want is to switch back and forth. You want to be consistent. So that being said, now I'm back and I want to work knit stitches around the outside, which means I need my yarn to be behind my stitches. So I'm going to bring the yarn, it was here, I'm just going to bring it across, back behind my stitches, just like that. Tuck it back out of the way. Note that this is the next working loop, so that's the one I'm going to grab when I grab the next stitch. So here's my first stitch, and now it's very easy. We're just going to keep knitting all the way around. So just pull the loop from the back to the front. I'm going to mark this one as the first stitch, and then I'm just going to keep going all the way around, just like that. Back to front. Let's zoom in for you. Back to front. And I'm going to keep doing that until I have the height I want on my sides. I'm done with the blue section of the side of my basket, and I'm ready to switch to green. You can see I've ended at the first stitch of the round. So now I need to basically just leave myself a tail and cut off the blue. So I'm going to open up a couple of these loops just like we showed before. Get right into the middle there where that thread is and just snip. And then I think I'll do one more right in the middle where the thread is and snip. So that's a big enough tail for me, and then I'm going to just cut off the yarn here. And that tail will get woven in later. I'm storing my extra yarn in the basket now that it's big enough. Okay, so let's start with the green. I'm going to do something fun with the green on this round to create a decorative border. So I'll show you that. First, we're going to start with a regular stitch. So I've already prepared a tail on the green here. And I'm just going to start by pulling the very first loop right here through the very first loop of this round, and then move my round marker up. There we go. Now, instead of putting this loop through here, I'm just going to let it drop in between the stitches. And then I'm going to put the next loop through the next stitch. Okay, again, I'm going to let one stitch drop or one loop drop between the stitches, and then put the next loop through the stitch. So I'm knitting one and then dropping one between the stitches. And what we're going to do is when we continue working around, we're going to just work with these knit stitches, and later we'll make a little border out of these dropped stitches. So I'm going to continue doing that around, knit one and then drop a stitch between, and then knit one and then drop a loop between the stitches. Knit one, drop a loop between the stitches, so on and so forth all the way around. I finished the round and I'm back to my marker, so I'm back to the first stitch. Now I have a dropped loop in between each stitch. So every time I've got two stitches, there's a dropped loop in between them. I want to make sure that I get one in here too, between the last stitch of the round and the first stitch of the next round. So drop one more loop between the last stitch and the first stitch. Now we're going to do the next round, and we're just going to knit the knit stitches, ignoring the dropped loops entirely. So I'm knitting the first stitch, moving my marker. There we go. Okay, and then I'm going to ignore this dropped loop that's between the stitches. Do you see how that's not coming through a blue stitch? That's how I know that's a dropped loop that's between the stitches. So push that, make sure it's in the front. Not critical, we can pull it through later if we need to, but it's nice to make sure it's in the front. And just knit the next stitch. Skip the dropped one, knit the next stitch. And what this is going to do is it's going to leave us with these exposed loops at the end. So skip the drop one and knit the next stitch. And when we're finished, when we're all finished knitting everything else, we're going to come back and we're going to basically bind off these stitches. And you can see that that's going to give us a neat little rope-like decorative edge around the join where the color changes. So that's what those are for, but we won't bother doing that until we've got the rest of this done. So now we're just going to go around and keep knitting, and again we're just going to knit the knit stitches and ignore the drop stitches. And once we finish this row, we'll just keep knitting on until we're done with the green section, and then I will come back. I've finished all the green. It's one round less than the number of rounds I did for the blue. And now I'm going to bind off. You can see I'm back to my starting point. So I'm going to bind off just like we did before. And again, we can remove the clip. And it's just pull the next loop through the current loop all the way around until all of the stitches are bound off and we're down to the last stitch. Okay, I made it to the end. I've bound off all my stitches and I'm down to the last one. So to finish it off, I'm going to take my tail and I'm going to pull it through this last stitch, and that will secure it, and then I'll weave in my tail. Just like that. So now again, I want to leave a tail that's easier to weave in. So I'm going to open up these loops from my tail. 2 loops should give me a decent sized tail. There we go. Grab my scissors, separate the 2 legs of the loop, and find that thread in the middle and just cut it. There's 1, and there's 2. So now that's enough of a tail. I can cut off the rest. Now let's do the decorative edge where we changed colors. Grab any loop. I'm just going for this one. It happens to be at the beginning, but doesn't matter. Okay. And start binding off just like we just did. Stick the next loop through the current loop. And keep doing that all the way around till we have 1 loop left. I've come to the end, and there's no tail or anything for me to weave this in with or connect it with. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to take a scrap of yarn that is 4, I think I got 5 loops here, but you only need 4 loops long, and cut open all of those loops. And it should be the green yarn. You don't want to use the blue yarn for this. Okay, so now I have my scrap of yarn. I'm going to thread it up through, and actually I'm going to connect it to this other one. So I'm going to lay this on top, thread it up through, and you guys be creative, however you want to thread it up is fine. And then I'm going to push it back down. So this is going to act like a normal tail that you would use to secure the end. It's basically coming up through the loop and tying it down. So I'm pushing that back through to the wrong side, and I'll push this tail back through to the wrong side. And now I have my decorative border all finished and secured. And later, when I'm weaving in ends, I'll just weave in these two ends and it'll secure it perfectly fine. And in fact, now is the time to weave in ends. So go ahead and turn your basket inside out, and you're going to weave in the ends just like you normally would for knitting. But I find it easier for this yarn if I use a crochet hook to do it. So let me grab a crochet hook and I'll show you how that works. All right, I have a relatively large crochet hook. This one is 6 millimeters. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick it in wherever I would want to weave the end in. And you don't have to be really careful about like duplicate stitching or anything like that with this yarn, because it's so fuzzy, nobody's going to see it anyway, and it's going to be on the inside of the basket. So just find spots to stick your hook, coming right up to where the yarn is coming out of. Loop the yarn over your hook and pull it through. And you probably only want to go through 2 or 3 loops this way, just because otherwise it sticks. It is fuzzy yarn. Okay, there's one, and then I'll come back up the other way like this and grab it. I'll probably just do that. Grab it, pull it through this way. Oop. See, that's what I meant about it sticking. There we go. Pull it through this way. And you can certainly do it with your fingers if it's being difficult. Here I'm just using my fingers. But that tends to open up the loops too much, so I try to avoid that. And now if you see gaps like this where we started or ended the round, it's a good idea to weave across the gaps to close them as well. So there, and then let's go in one more direction and then call it done. And this is probably overkill, but I always overkill when I'm weaving in. I get paranoid about it. Okay, so that's all woven in. Trim it off and weave in all the other ends the same way, being sure that you're weaving in into the same color with each end. Okay, all my ends are woven in and I am ready to assemble my basket. So first I'm going to turn it right side out. And what I have done is I've made myself a ring out of plastic mesh. This is the needlepoint plastic canvas that you would use. And I've made myself a ring that's the same size as the inside of my basket. I measured it by taking a couple pieces, sticking them in the basket, and going like this until it fit inside it. So I'm going to stick this inside my basket and use that same motion to kind of push it out on the ends. Make sure I'm pulling my basket edges up so it's nicely fit inside the basket. There you go, nice and snug, right? You can see it in there nicely around the edges. Now I'm going to take the green part and push it in. And that hides the plastic mesh, but the plastic mesh still makes it stand up nice and straight. And you want to just smooth it all out, make sure there's no wrinkles. And this decorative edge we did now should sit right nicely on top and become the edge of our basket. If you enjoyed this project, please give me a thumbs up, share it with your friends, or leave me a comment. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel for more great videos. Thanks for watching.